another chapter in the Hiram Key. In fact, it is the last chapter. I believe after this, and it's a fairly long chapter. After that, though, we just have a postscript, some appendices, which I don't know that I will necessarily read. I still haven't quite decided, and then a bunch of pictures that were in the middle of the book that I did not show at the time, and I'm going to show them in that last reading. So, first things first, though, the 15th chapter. So, let me get settled in here a little bit. The Lost Scrolls Rediscovered is the name of this final chapter. Okay, here we go. Why, we asked ourselves, does the United States of America exist? It did not have to come into existence, and we doubt that without the benefit of hindsight, many modern observers would have given it any chance of being successful in becoming the hub of world culture and the most powerful nation on earth within less than 2 centuries. The plan for the United States was not a development of anything obvious that had gone before in Europe. It was something apparently quite new and very radical. But the inspiration for a new country where every individual counts, where the people themselves are responsible for the state, and where they personally answer to their God, had to come from somewhere. We felt with growing certainty that it came via Freemasonry and the Templars from the man we know as Jesus, who himself lived in a time of oppression when he sought equality, justice, and enlightenment for all his people. His outlook could not and did not go beyond the boundaries of his own nation, but in time the message he gave to the world was heard and acted upon. We found the following words of especial interest. Quote, "Observe good faith and justice toward all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct, and can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and, at no distant period, a great nation, to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence." End quote. They were spoken by George Washington in his farewell address, and the words chosen clearly confirmed what is already well known. This first president of the United States was a lifelong Freemason. They also sound strangely reminiscent of the lost teachings of Jesus, talking of the importance of freedom, enlightenment, peace, good faith, justice, and benevolence, as well as aspiring to the building of a great nation and the binding together of a religion and morality. These characteristics expressed by Washington may sound to modern ears like the sort of words one would use on such an occasion, but at the time they were spoken, they were quite remarkable. Hey Vesper, good evening. How are you tonight? Just getting started here. I am doing great. An acceptance of Templar artifacts on the eastern seaboard of the United States does not explain how this outlawed French order could have possibly influenced the founding principles of that country. To understand the full sequence of events, we decided that we first needed to look closely at the other Templar outpost, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean on the western coast of Scotland. That many Templars settled in Scotland after the collapse of their order in mainland Europe is well documented, and the evidence is still plain to see today. The church at Kilmartin, near Loch Awe in Argyll, contains many examples of Templar graves and tomb carvings showing Templar figures. Furthermore, there are many Masonic graves in the churchyard. On visiting the site in 1990, we had been immediately struck by a maritime monument in the wall of the churchyard to a captain lost at sea during the 1600s. What was so striking was that the monument consists of two pillars framing a skull and crossbones, the Templar fleet's battle flag and symbol of a master mason, framed by the motif which linked Freemasonry with Sekenenre Tao. This was extremely exciting, but even more exciting was the large number of Templar graves and carvings within the churchyard. As we discussed these findings, it seemed to us that if a large enough contingent of Templars had fled to Argyll in the early 1300s, then we should expect more than one site of Templar graves. Over the next few weeks, we worked out from Kilmartin, exploring all the old churchyards and burial grounds. Wow, and burial grounds we could find. We soon discovered several more sites with at least one Templar grave, and whilst we were not particularly looking for them, we also found extremely old graves bearing Masonic symbols. Glad to hear that. We had long been aware that there was a strong Templar connection with this area of Scotland from the time when Hugh de Payens married Catherine de St. Clair. In fact, the first Templar preceptory outside the Holy Land was built on St. Clair land at a site to the south of Edinburgh, now known as Temple. By the beginning of the 14th century, the Templars had many estates in Scotland and a great deal of affection and respect from the people. The Scottish Sanctuary. Scotland had always been an important location for the Templar Order, but we discovered that the political circumstances in Scotland made it a particularly suitable sanctuary after the attack by King Philip and the Pope. Following the death of King Alexander III in 1286, the ancient line of Celtic kings had come to an abrupt end because he had no children nor brothers or sisters. His only direct heir was Margaret, the Maid of Norway, but she died en route to Scotland, leaving the succession in dispute. The country became weakened by infighting, and King Edward I of England took advantage of the situation by lending support to John de Balliol, who was one of the contenders for the throne, demanding in return for this support that Balliol become a vassal of the English king and do homage for his Scottish kingdom. The people were not fooled, and he was an unpopular king known as Tomb Tabard, which translates as empty gown, but meant more accurately glove puppet of Edward I. The English king had no respect for the man either, and treated him as a common vassal, humiliating him publicly on one occasion by insisting that Balliol stand trial for a claimed debt to a London wine importer. Balliol finally turned against Edward in 1296 when he refused the English king's instruction to help fight the French. Edward responded by marching on Berwick and disposing of Balliol, sending him into exile in France and claiming direct rule over Scotland for himself. To ensure that no Celt could make a counterclaim, the Englishman carried off the symbol of Scottish independence, the ancient Stone of Destiny, or Stone of Scone, as it is also known. This small, roughly hewn rectangular block, upon which the kings of Scotland had long been crowned, was never returned and still rests under the English throne in Westminster Abbey. After stealing the Scots symbol of independence, the English king set about establishing a governor in Scotland to rule it on his behalf, leaving the unhappy Scots heavily oppressed under this dictatorial leadership. The first resurgence of Scottish nationalism came very quickly, sparked when the nobleman William Wallace killed the Sheriff of Lanark as revenge for the murder of his wife in May 1297. This was an affront to the English king, and Wallace would have been severely punished, but popular support rose strongly behind him, leading to a fully fledged battle at Stirling Bridge on 11 September 1297, at which Edward's forces were defeated. Edward I made peace with the French, and then turned his full attention to the troublesome Wallace, whom he defeated at Linlithgow the following year. Wallace escaped capture and immediately traveled to France, seeking support from Edward's old enemies for his cause. He is reported to have received letters from King Philip the Fair commending his cause to Pope Clement V, and it is certain from the support he gained from the Moray family, whose name has been continually linked with the Templars and Freemasonry, that he made contact with the Templars during this time. He was successful in gaining this support because there was a battle between the Scots and the English at Roslin in 1303, which was won with the support of Templar knights led by a St. Clair. Wallace remained an outlaw, hunted by the English crown for 7 years before being betrayed and taken to London and hung, drawn and quartered, in 1305. Following his execution and dismemberment, parts of Wallace's body were hung in Newcastle on Tyne, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. Throughout this period of unrest, there were 2 Scots who had a genuine but not indisputable claim upon the throne, one being Robert the Bruce, the 8th Earl of Carrick, and the other John Comyn. Robert was an ambitious man, and he first sought advancement by working with Edward I, but his support for the Englishman became weaker as he began to feel that he was not going to get the elevation he wanted. When Robert started to investigate other options for building his personal status in Scotland, his opponent, Comyn, took advantage of the situation by telling Edward that Robert the Bruce was scheming against him. The king would have disposed of such an irritation without a second thought, but a supporter warned Robert the Bruce of the imminent danger, and he had to think pretty quickly. His options were suddenly much reduced, and he decided to take a huge gamble. He knew that there was a fledgling Celtic resurgence, and that the Scots would not easily accept a king who was an English vassal forever. So he decided to become the spark that lit the powder keg. He knew that Comyn was a favorite of the Pope and well liked by Edward I, so he conspired to polarize his position by publicly insulting the Pope and the King whilst raising the battle standard for the growing Celtic revival. This he did in one pre-planned move when he had Comyn lured to the Franciscan church at Dumfries and attacked him right on the steps of the altar itself. As Comyn lay bleeding, Robert refused to allow the monks to aid the dying man, and stood over him until he was sure that his opponent had bled to death. This brutal act, committed on sacred ground, outraged both Edward and the Pope, but the Scottish patriots took it as a brave deed of open defiance against the English because Comyn had inherited John de Balliol's claim to the throne and was supported by King Edward I. The Pope responded by announcing on 10 February 1305 that Robert the Bruce was, from that moment, excommunicated. Despite this ultimate punishment from the Pope, 13 months later, Bruce had the total support of the Celtic lords and was crowned King of Scotland by the Countess of Buchan at Scone, without the benefit of the Stone of Destiny. This then was the situation in Scotland when part of the Templar fleet made the decision to head to Argyll and the Firth of Forth, where they knew Robert the Bruce was engaged in a rebellion against England. The fact that Robert the Bruce was excommunicated, combined with the long St. Clair family links with Roslin, was the greatest attraction of Scotland as a sanctuary. It was one of the few places on the planet where the Pope could not get at them. Because of the war with the English, the Templars also knew that as skilled warriors they would be received with open arms. Kind of in the middle of... Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Just 3 months before Philip the Fair sprang his trap on the Templars, Edward I of England died, to be succeeded by his weak and ineffectual son Edward II, who almost instantly retreated to England, leaving Robert I to tidy up his enemies in Scotland. History records that that the Bruce had nothing but major setbacks in 1306 and 7, but after that he rallied from an apparently hopeless situation and began systematically winning back his kingdom from the English. The Scots' great triumph was the Battle of Bannockburn on 6 November 1314. The battle is recorded as going strongly against Bruce's army until an intervention by an unknown reserve force quickly turned the tide of the whole battle and ensured victory for the Scots. Stories quickly spread that these mysterious warriors had carried the buisson, the battle flag of the Templars. A Templar intervention indeed seems to be the only possible explanation. So in the same year that Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny were roasted alive in Paris, the Battle of Bannockburn was being won by the arrival of a Templar force led by the Grand Master of the Scottish Templars, Sir William St. Clair. This victory at Bannockburn declared and put in place the freedom of the Bruce's kingdom in Scotland. The St. Clairs' part in this victory was well rewarded, as they received a bishopric and additional lands to add to their Roslin holdings. This great victory was the major step in securing a permanent independence for Scotland, and King Robert I spent the remainder of his life fighting the English in Ireland and along the Scottish borders until eventually, in 1328, England formally recognized Scotland as a free nation. A point of Masonic interest concerning the Battle of Bannockburn is that it was fought on the day with the longest daylight in the year, a day still celebrated by all Freemasons as the Feast of St. John the Baptist. Also the spring equinox, or no, not spring equinox, not uh, summer solstice. That's what I meant. I misspoke. It seems that the Templars had found a good haven in Scotland, but it was obviously a symbiotic relationship with the King of Scotland benefiting from the skills of these professional warriors, probably in terms of strategic planning at first, but eventually in direct combat assistance as well. For a while, the Templars were safe with Robert I being excommunicated, but this state of affairs, whilst good for the Templars, was not good for Scotland, because a kingdom whose king was excommunicated was viewed as a pagan land, and any Christian ruler was free to mount a crusade against heathens. Unless good relations were eventually restored between the Scottish king and the Bishop of Rome, Scotland could find itself at great risk of lawless invasion in the future. In 1317, Pope John the 22nd tried to impose a truce on the Scots and English, and was said to have been furious when Robert the Bruce responded by capturing the border town of Berwick in a surprise attack. Papal-Scottish relations deteriorated still further when the English gleefully told tales at the papal court of Scottish war-making and obstinacy, and in 1320 the Pope sent two papal legates to serve a further sentence of excommunication against Bruce, James the Black Douglas, and the Earl of Moray. The defense of these further charges were met with the Declaration of Arbroath, which was published by the Scottish barons on 6 April 1320. It is very Masonic in nature, and concerning Robert the Bruce it states, quote, "All were bound to him by right and by the service that he had rendered his people. The nobles said that they fought not for glory or riches or honors, but only for liberty, which no true man would yield save with his life." End quote. It also gives this definition of kingship. Quote, "The due and lawful consent of all the people made him our king and prince. To him we were obliged and resolved to adhere to in all things, both on account of his right and his own merit, as being the person who hath restored the people's safety in defense of their liberties. But after all, if this prince shall leave these principles he hath so nobly pursued, and consent that we or our kingdom be subjected to the king or people of England, we will immediately endeavor to expel him as our enemy, and as a subverter both of his own and our rights, and will make another king who will defend our liberties." End quote. The senior lords of Scotland were Templars, or consorts of the Templars, and it is hardly surprising that their Nazarene style of thought is present in this unusually democratic document that turns the idea of king into more of a president. Certainly one of the signatories to the document was the Lord Henry St. Clair of Roslin. Surely, we reasoned, it has to be significant that Nazarene slash Templar slash Masonic thinking was present at many important points in Western history when the subject of popular leadership and will of the people were the main factors. In England, 100 years before the declaration of Arbroath, the Magna Carta was signed by King John, under persuasion by a group that included Templars. To this day, it is the only document in the English Constitution that can be loosely compared to the Bill of Rights of the United States, a document that, as we will show later, was wholly Masonically inspired. In October 1328, for political reasons which are of no great importance to our story, Pope John the 22nd released Robert I from the ban of excommunication, but the now legitimate Scottish king died at the age of 55 on 3 June 1329, just 10 days before John the 22nd published a bull publicly recognizing his right to the throne of Scotland. Robert was succeeded by his son David II, who was only 5 years old, and Lord Randolph, a member of the Moray family and uncle of the Earl of Moray, was appointed as regent. The death of Robert the Bruce was not the end of his links with the Templars. Before dying, he had taken a vow to go to Jerusalem and fight the Saracen, and as a mark of respect, his embalmed heart was taken by Sir William de St. Clair and Sir James Douglas on a last crusade to Jerusalem, but unfortunately they were killed in battle in Andalusia en route. Bruce's heart never reached the Holy City, and was returned to be buried in Melrose Abbey, whilst Sir William was buried at Roslin. As soon as Scotland was once again officially part of Christendom, it was imperative that the Templars should disappear from sight by becoming a secret society. As the power of the Vatican was now able to once again persecute its enemies across the whole of Europe, fortunately, during the transition period, a member of the Templar Moray family was regent, ruling on behalf of the infant King David II, and this gave them the level of control they needed to plan the future of the organization that had already replaced their doomed order, so that they could retain the great secrets with which they had become entrusted. Return to Roslin. A new secret order would ensure the survival of the Templar rites and thinking, and the plans for this changeover must have been developed in parallel with the papal negotiations, so that by the time Scotland once again paid homage to the Pope, the Templars of Scotland were invisible to those who did not know where to look, and one of the places worth looking was the St. Clair family. As we discussed in Chapter 5, Roslin Chapel, built by the later William St. Clair, had already proven itself to be hugely important to our quest because it was the construction of this edifice that provided the interface between the Templars and Freemasonry. The use of American plants in decorative stone carving, the aloe and Indian maize, that should have been totally unknown at the time, had provided us with undeniable evidence that someone connected with the St. Clairs had traversed the Atlantic at a remarkably early date. Our first visit to the chapel built by Earl William St. Clair was now some 4 years in the past, and as we had learned an incredible amount in the intervening time, we decided to return to this linchpin of a building. Once again we set out at 7:30 in the morning, arriving shortly after noon in the quiet Scottish village. It was a pleasant early summer day, warm but with a broken cloud cover that caused the sun to throw its beams hither and thither across the green rolling hillsides, lighting the many pinnacles of Rosslyn Chapel in a most dramatic manner. Entering the chapel was like greeting an old friend. It was familiar and inviting, yet interesting and exciting, and hopefully it would have lots of new information to share with us. We certainly had plenty of discoveries to put to test in Roslyn. As we walked into the building, we were pleased to find it deserted, so that we could enjoy its powerful, ugh, so that we could enjoy its powerful personality without distraction. Roslyn Chapel exudes a sense of living spirituality, a feeling of the here and now combined with an infinite past. Both of us have a fondness for church buildings, but every church we know has a lifeless and empty character compared to Roslyn. It is hard to describe the warm feeling that embraces you in this medieval structure without sounding overly fanciful, but Robert summed it up by observing that it was the only church or chapel where he could happily sleep the night alone. We strolled through the nave, enjoying the place, and then turned our attention first of all to the carvings of the maze and the aloe cactus. Subconsciously, to reassure ourselves that we had not imagined what we had seen on our first visit. There was no need to worry, there was no doubt about what we were looking at. As we studied the cactus lintel, a lady vicar approached from the north doorway and, with a warm smile, asked if we had seen the Indian maze. We replied that we had, and she started to discuss the subject. The Reverend Janet Dyer turned out to have been trained in botany, and her husband is a botanist by profession. The aloe cactus, the aloe cactus is remarkable, isn't it? End quote, she said, glancing up at the frieze. Quote, I suppose it could be something else, but then I really don't know what it is if it is not an aloe. End quote. She swung a little to the left and pointed out up towards the Indian maize arch. Quote, my husband says that maize is accurate, probably a slightly immature plant. End quote. She continued her helpful commentary by referring to the documented evidence that Prince Henry Sinclair, the first St. Clair Jarl, Earl, of the Orkneys, had, thanks to Templar money, commissioned a fleet of 12 ships for a voyage to the New World. The fleet under Antonio Zeno landed in Nova Scotia and explored the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States of America prior to 1400. The date is certain because Henry Sinclair was murdered upon his return in that year. It seemed only logical that lives must have been lost on such an expedition, and the Sinclair family claimed that a knight called Sir James Gunn died in the Americas and was buried there. The image of the medieval knight found at Westford, Massachusetts, is, they claim, his hastily prepared tombstone. We found evidence to support this in the crypt below the chapel, where a small coat of arms on the wall shows on its left-hand side, above the engrailed cross of the Sinclair family, a single-masted, twin-sailed ship identical to the one found on the shield of the Westford Knight. It, too, is shown pointing to the west, but instead of furled sails under Western Star, this vessel is under full sail. As we looked around the chapel's interior, Robert could not take his eyes off the Hamilton organ that was housed in the Victorian expansion on the west wall. Quote, may I have a look at the organ, please? End quote, he asked the Reverend Janet. Quote, certainly, help yourself. End quote. Her reply was so friendly and relaxed that Robert pushed his luck a little further. Quote, would you mind if I played it? I am the organist at Christ Church in my home village. End quote. Having received permission, Robert climbed the spiral staircase to the organ gallery, and a couple of minutes later, the nave was resounding to the sound of Quumronda. It's CWM is the first word. Uh, so, sound of Quumronda as Chris continued filming the many items of interest. As we started to take in the details of the building, our attention was quickly drawn to the freestanding pillars, of which there are 14 in total. 12 identical in form and 2 special and quite splendid ones at the eastern end of the chapel. The left-hand pillar is known as the Mason's Pillar and is a beautifully proportioned and elegant piece of work. The right-hand pillar is quite different, known as the Apprentice Pillar. It is lavishly decorated with the 4 floral swaths spiraling down and around the fluted center from the corners of the capital to meet the base at its opposite side. The significance of these symbols was of great importance to the builders of this chapel, but the meaning has long been lost. However, our reconstruction of the past allowed us to understand what we were looking at. The so-called Mason's Pillar is actually a rendering of the priestly pillar known to Freemasons as Yakin and to the Nazarenes as Tzedek, and the Apprentice Pillar is the kingly pillar called Boaz, representing the power of Mishpat. One thing we had to look for in this conundrum of a building was any reference to Hiram Abiff. We would have been surprised if this Holy Templar/Masonic building did not have a figure with a hole in its forehead. The distinctive head injury that we now know came down from Sekenenre Tau, and sure enough, we found it. High up in the corner where the south and east walls meet, level with the organ, is a head with a severe gash on the right temple, and in the opposite side of the west wall is the head of the person who killed him. These heads have been well known for hundreds of years, but their true symbolism has been lost, replaced by a harmless but implausible story. I'm just going to look ahead, see how far we are into the chapter. I know this is a long one. Okay. Okay. To get a better view, we both climbed the spiral staircase to the organ gallery and took in the splendid view of the chapel from what was originally the west wall before the horrendous baptistry was stuck on in 1882. From this vantage point, we were very close to the head of Hiram Abiff, and we could see the head wound with great clarity. This wound has long been noted, and the generally accepted story is that it is the head of a murdered apprentice, and the opposite head is that of his master who killed him. According to this legend, a master stonemason went to Rome looking for inspiration for the design of the kingly pillar, but while he was away, his apprentice quickly designed and made the pillar that stands there today. Because it was so much better than anything the master had done, or could have done, upon his return to Roslyn he hit his junior with a mallet, striking him dead on the spot. This story sounds like a corrupted version of the Masonic Hiram Abiff legend, and it can easily be dismissed as the reason for the presence of the wounded head. We know this because William St. Clair himself masterminded the whole construction of the building from its inception to his own death in 1484, just 2 years before its completion. Furthermore, he personally supervised every tiny detail of the work. It is a matter of record that every carving, however small, was first created in wood and submitted for approval, and if so approved, it was then carved in stone. William St. Clair had brought some of Europe's finest masons to Scotland for this great project, building the village of Roslyn to house them, and he paid the master masons the then massive amount of £40 per annum, and the lesser masons a still handsome £10 per annum. The idea that after all this preparation and expense, a mere apprentice would be allowed to produce the centerpiece of the entire building seems unlikely in the extreme. The current caretakers of Roslyn Chapel did not know it, but the head high up facing the northeast corner is a representation of Sekenenre Tau, the last true king of Egypt. I'm halfway through reading Picatrix. Have you read it? I have not read it yet. No, it's on my list, though. Let there be light. As we talked about the true significance of the pillars and the wounded head, and the fact that the original reasons for them had become lost, slowly but surely a veil of darkness started to lift from our eyes. Had we been blind? The great light of truth about the building suddenly seemed so blindingly obvious. Rosalind Chapel was not a chapel at all. It was not even really Christian. For a start, there is no altar. To operate as a chapel, a table has been set up in the center of the building because there is no room in the east where the pillars stand. Behind Boaz and Yakin, there are 3 stone pedestals set against the wall, but these are not altars. This structure was not built as a place of Christian worship. We had known that a later William St. Clair, who later became the first elected Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, had been in trouble with the church for having his children baptized in the building. But the importance of this point had not sunk in before. Upon checking with the official history, we found that Rosslyn had to be reconsecrated in 1862. Prior to that date, there is uncertainty about its consecrated status. In fact, one of the objections King James VI raised to his Earl of Rosslyn as Grand Master of Masons, to this Earl of Rosslyn as Grand Master of Masons, was that he had had his children baptized at Rosslyn, which was not a Christian place of worship. The more we looked, the more obvious this fact became. The symbolism is Egyptian, Celtic, Jewish, Templar, and Masonic in profusion. A star-studded ceiling, vegetative growths coming from the mouths of the Celtic green man, entangled pyramids, images of Moses, towers of the heavenly Jerusalem, engrailed crosses, as well as squares and compasses. The only certain Christian imagery was in later Victorian alterations, the stained glass windows, the revolting baptistry, and a statue of the Madonna and Child. Some small elements of decoration have been described as Christian by the Episcopal Church, but on close inspection they are not what they seem. In the area of the north wall, there is a small frieze showing the crucifixion, but there are good reasons to believe that this is not the crucifixion of Jesus the Christ. It is the torture of the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay. Firstly, all characters are in medieval garb, including hooded members of the Inquisition. The details are correct in that the cross is a tau or T shape, and the nails are being driven through the wrists. 2 details that medieval artists invariably got wrong, unless of course they knew what had actually happened to de Molay. Another section shows Templars with an executioner next to them, and most remarkably we found a carving here that has figures holding up the Shroud of Turin, with the face of de Molay clearly visible. We would have expected that the Templars in Scotland would know of the suffering of their master, but we now also knew that they were aware of the story of his image miraculously appearing on his own ritual shroud. Further confirmation that this building was not what everybody imagined it to be came when we read that even after its completion, it was never used as a chapel because there was a family chapel in the castle, a small distance away. The current caretakers admit that it was odd to spend a large fortune as well as some 45 years building a chapel and then never use it even once. This seems to stump them, as they have put forth no suggestion as to why this was so. The obvious was starting to descend upon us, and we both had a simultaneous attack of goose pimples. Rosslyn was not a simple chapel. It was a post-Templar shrine built to house the scrolls found by Hugh de Payan and his team under the Holy of Holies of the last temple at Jerusalem. Beneath our feet was the most priceless treasure in Christendom. In comparison to these treasures, the Dead Sea Scrolls are humble also-rans. The Nazareans/Qumranians were instructed by the Assumption of Moses to put their most treasured scrolls under the Holy of Holies in around AD 69, and more mundane material, such as the community rule, was deposited around Judea in places as humble as the caves of Qumran. Following these examples, Rosslyn Chapel was a deliberate replication of the burial place of the secret scrolls. The unearthing of the Dead Sea Scrolls caused a major sensation. We could not help but wonder how the world would respond to this discovery. We believe that these scrolls are likely to deal with the story of the Nazarene struggle, the story of Jesus the Christ, the secret ceremony of resurrecting the living, and the importance of building the human spirit as though it were a temple. They will tell us about the life of Jesus, and as such must be the lost gospel of Q, the gospel that was the source material for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We sat on a pew and stared at the thick stone floor, honored and numbed with excitement because we suddenly knew with utter certainty that we were just feet away from everything we had been searching for, the reason and purpose for the creation of Freemasonry. It took 10 minutes to compose ourselves sufficiently to continue our fact-finding. We looked at historical information for further clues. They were not long coming. Having decided that the Nazarene scrolls were under Rosslyn, it was only minutes later that we knew that that they were contained in precisely 4 trunks. This came to light when we read an account of a fire that occurred in 1447, 1 year after the foundation stone was laid. William St. Clair held many titles, including the Prince of Orkney, and the following account uses that description. Quote, about this time, 1447, there was a fire in the square keep of Rosslyn Castle, by occasion of which the occupants were forced to flee the building. The prince's chaplain, seeing this and remembering all of his master's writings, passed to the head of the dungeon where they all were, and threw out 4 great trunks where they were. The news of the fire coming to the prince through the lamentable cries of the ladies and gentlewomen, and the sight thereof coming to his view in the place where he stood upon College Hill, he was sorry for nothing but the loss of his charters and other writings, but when the chaplain, who had saved himself by coming down the bell rope tied to a beam, declared how his charters and writs were all saved, he became cheerful and went to recomfort his princess and the ladies. End quote. What could have been so important in those 4 trunks that William St. Clair could only think of them in the fire and not his own wife and the other ladies? Surely he cannot have been so heartless and insecure as to worry first about simple civil documentation about his lands or titles. In any case, medieval trunks are fairly huge affairs, and such papers would not fill a quarter of one of these containers, let alone 4. So those trunks contained the scrolls from Jerusalem that had been brought to Scotland by the Knights Templar and were now entrusted to him as the greatest treasure in the whole world. If those scrolls had been destroyed before he had completed the shrine to house them, he would have been in utter despair. William St. Clair dedicated his life to the construction of the scroll shrine, and we are certain that the 4 trunks are still there beneath 3 feet of solid rock. The more we looked and the more we read of Roslyn's history, the more confirmation we got. Apparently, it is generally considered that the building was erected very quickly, but the foundations took a curiously long time. From the commencement of work to the completion of the foundation took 4 years, a ridiculous length of time, as the chapel is a relatively small, single room with a very tiny crypt at a lower level in the east. This has puzzled historians, but we now knew exactly why it took so long. The mission of William St. Clair was to recreate the underground vaults of Herod's Temple exactly as Hugh de Payens and the other 8 knights had found them over 300 years earlier. We suspected that the underground system was far larger than everything above ground, and that the scrolls had found a final resting place in a reconstruction of their original home. It was at this point that our one major inconsistency resolved itself. We now knew why the Royal Arch Decree described the location of the excavation as Zerubbabel's temple instead of Herod's temple. Those who first created the Royal Arch Decree, either aging disenfranchised Templars or their descendants in Scotland relied on stories handed down in the verbal traditions of Hugh de Payens, which told that the setting of the excavation was Zerubbabel's temple. It is now known the Crusaders believed that the Muslim dome on the rock, which dates from the 7th century, was Herod's temple, and the ruins beneath it those of Zerubbabel's. From the outside, Rosslyn is a representation in stone of the heavenly Jerusalem as depicted in Lambert's copy, with towers and a huge central curved arched roof. Inside the Rosslyn shrine, the layout is a reconstruction of the ruin of Herod's temple, decorated with Nazarene and Templar symbolism. In the northeast corner, we found a section of the wall carved with the towers of the heavenly Jerusalem, complete with the Masonic compasses, styled exactly as they are shown on Lambert's scroll. Upon a more detailed examination of the bases that had once carried statuettes, we realized that this image of the heavenly Jerusalem appeared many times. As we looked directly upwards from the organ loft, we could see that the arched roof had a running series of keystones down its length, just like the one the Royal Arch degree describes as found in the ruins of Herod's temple. Over 3 feet thick of solid rock, those keystones were locking together a huge weight. Carved into the undersurface of the roof above us was a starry firmament as found in the pyramids and Masonic lodges, and tucked in between was the sun, the moon, a cornucopia, a dove, and 4 heavenly figures. Thinking about the Royal Arch degree, we realized that if our idea that the Rosslyn building was a reconstruction of the ruined temple of Herod, we should expect the design of the building to conform to the description given in the ritual. We remembered the relevant words spoken in that degree. Quote, "Early this morning, on resuming our labors, we discovered a pair of pillars of exquisite beauty and symmetry. Proceeding with our work, we discovered 6 other pairs of equal beauty, which from their situation appeared to be the remains of the subterranean gallery leading to the most holy place." End quote. 14 pillars in total, exactly as we saw before us in Rosslyn. William St. Clair had followed his script with care. We consulted the ritual of Royal Arch to see if there were more requirements that should predict the layout of this shrine. There is a reference to the so-called lights of the order, which definitely refer to a planned formation. Quote, "These lights are placed in the form of an equilateral triangle, each of the lesser bisecting the line formed by 2 dividing the great triangle into 3 lesser triangles on the extremities, which by their union form a 4th triangle in the center, and all of them equal and equilateral, emblematic of the 4 points or divisions of masonry. This symbolic arrangement corresponds to the mysterious triple tau." End quote. We recalled that it was the mark of the tau that the Kenites wore upon their foreheads when Moses first met them, and the shape of the cross upon which both Jesus and de Molay had suffered. In Rosslyn, we observed that the 14 pillars had been arranged so that the eastern 8 of them, including Boaz and Yakin, were laid out in a form of a triple tau. The formation of the proportions were exactly as the Royal Arch degree depicts this device today. There can be no coincidence here. All of the pillars of Rosslyn are laid out to a precise plan according to ancient wisdom and as given in the Royal Arch ritual. Another point that has puzzled historians was the fact that the chapel was never finished and was quote, clearly intended as the first section of a much larger and grander building, a major cathedral, end quote. There is no known reason why the St. Clair family should have suddenly stopped building and forget the 45-year-old project if it had been their intention to build a collegiate church. Yet the west wall is huge, totally incompatible with the rest of the structure, and very obviously incomplete. It has decoration on what is now its exterior side that has been taken to indicate that it was intended as an internal wall for some non-existent larger building. To all intents and purposes, it looks like a ruin of a much larger structure, except it is known that there never was one. But we know that there was. Thinking about it, it would have been strange to complete a small chapel if the intention was to build a great medieval church, and as a cathedral in the middle of nowhere at that. The west wall is incomplete, and the obvious normal conclusion is that it was never finished. But there is another reason why single walls remain. They are the remains of a ruined cathedral, or more precisely in this case, a ruined temple. We could not forget that Hugh de Payon and his team found the scrolls whilst investigating ruins, and the Royal Arch ritual reminds us of the fact. Quote, on clearing away the fragments and rubbish which obstructed our progress, we came to some thing which seemed to be solid rock, but accidentally striking it with my crow, it emitted a hollow sound. We then cleared away more of the loose earth and rubbish. End quote. The Roslin Shrine was completed exactly to plan. There never was an intention of building further because that huge west wall is a carefully executed reconstruction of the ruin of Herod's temple that the Knights Templar first entered in their exploration in Jerusalem in AD 1118. We then recalled the next part of the ritual, which says, quote, when we found that instead of a solid rock there was a series of stones in the form of an arch, and being aware that the architect of the previous structure had designed no part of it in vain, end quote. Just as, quote, the architect of the previous had designed no part in vain, end quote, neither had William St. Clair. Every facet of this fascinating structure was there to tell a story. Today, the original western entrance has lost its intended dramatic effect of the reconstructed Herodian ruin because the Victorians stuck an ill-conceived baptistry right onto it. The sooner this invasive carbuncle is sliced off this wonderful shrine, the better. The lost secret of Mark Masonry rediscovered. The more we looked, the more we realized that there was nothing accidental about this building. Every detail was carefully considered and important to the great story frozen into the Roslin Shrine. The fact that all carvings were first made in wood and taken for approval to overseers, and finally to Lord St. Clair himself, reminded us of the ritual used by the Masonic degree known as Mark Masonry. The ceremony revolves around events that supposedly occurred during the building of King Solomon's temple, and the candidate performs the role of a fellow craft Freemason, the rank of a second-degree craft Mason, and tours the lodge room as the last of three workmen who put forward their work for the approval of the junior, senior, and master overseers, who are placed respectively at the south, west, and east gates. The three pedestals are visited in turn, and at each the first two workmen, the deacons of the lodge, have their work tested against the plan, and approval is given. When the candidate presents his work, it is a small keystone and does not meet with approval. The junior and senior overseers state that it is a curiously wrought stone that does not meet with the plan, but because of its fine workmanship they will allow the workman to pass on to the next gate. Finally, the entered apprentice arrives at the pedestal of the master overseer, who flies into a rage because the candidate has had the audacity to present a stone to him that is not required for the building, and he orders the stone to be cast into the waste of the quarry. He then states that the candidate should be put to death for his impudence, but after a plea is put in for leniency, the intimidated candidate is allowed to go free. The workmen are then called to go and receive their wages in the middle chamber of King Solomon's temple, and the candidate joins the queue and puts his hands through a small hole known as the wicket to take his payment. He is immediately grabbed by the hand and denounced as an impostor, and an axe is brought down as though about to sever his hand at the wrist. Once again, thankfully, he is spared. It is then detected that all work has stopped for the lack of a keystone to complete the arch. The overseers state that they recall such a stone being brought to them, and a search is made for the lost keystone that will lock the arch together. It is found by the candidate, who is then made a mark mason and is provided with a mark, a small symbol, that becomes his personal trademark. Rosslyn Shrine has hundreds of such mason's marks carved into it. Chris was made a mark mason, and at the time, none of his initiation had made very much sense either to him or those initiating him, but now the mystery was clearing rapidly. It is possible for us to understand how the murdered apprentice legend developed at Roslyn as a composite of the Hiram Abief story and the Mark Mason story. William St. Clair had an obvious problem with security. The Masons building his scroll shrine had to know the layout of the underground vault network, and they knew that this strange building was to house something of great value. William St. Clair was a brilliant and talented man, and we believe that he devised the first degree of craft masonry and the Mark Mason degree to give his operative masons a code of conduct and an involvement in the secret, without telling them the great secret of living resurrection, which was reserved for speculative masons. It is a matter of record that he had two grades of stonemason on site, the 10-pound a year standard masons or apprentices, and the 40-pound a year mark masons, who were honored by the possession of a personal mark in the continental fashion. Both classes of craftsmen must have been aware that they were rebuilding King Solomon's temple for some strange reason, although it was actually Herod's temple. When Sir William St. Clair first planned the building of his scroll shrine, he needed to be certain that he had the loyalty and fidelity of his stonemasons, so that they would keep his lawful secrets as securely as their own. In order to do this, he would have to bind them to secrecy, and we believe that the entrance degree of Freemasonry, known today as that of entered apprentice, was developed by Sir William at the outset of building, using selected elements of the Templar initiation ceremony so that he could ensure that any necessary secrets he had to pass on to these people were within a system of obligation. To maintain differentials, he had to provide the 40-pound per year senior craftsmen with an extra secret so that they had something more than their lesser masons. We believe that both grades were told the secret of the kingly or Boaz pillar and were called, as they are today, entered apprentices, and the higher ranks were told the importance of the keystone of the arch because they were mark masons. Neither rank was ever allowed to know the secret of the priestly pillar or the significance of twin pillars and the keystone combined. Okay, and then they have, um, I don't know what to call it. It's not a chart. It's just bold writing, and it's got almost like an equation, a math equation. And it says Mishpat or kingly or Boaz plus the plus symbol, Tzedek or priestly or Yakin equals stability. Or more simply, strength plus establishment equals stability. The great formula that secured stability in ancient Egypt had to be preserved and reserved for the philosophers, the speculative masons, men like William St. Clair himself. The masons who worked in stone knew secrets to an appropriate level, but none were ever raised by living resurrection to the rank of a speculative master mason. We now could be certain, without any shadow of doubt, that the starting place for Freemasonry was the construction of Roslyn Chapel in the mid-15th century. Later historical developments confirm this view because the St. Clair family of Roslyn became the hereditary Grand Masters of the crafts and guilds and orders of Scotland, and later held the post of the Master of Masons in Scotland until the late 1700s. As we well know, many modern Freemasons believe that their organization is descended from the semi literate working class ritual practices of the medieval guilds of stonemasons. It is an origin theory that is riddled with problems, yet it did seem to explain the well documented references to the early operative lodges of Scotland. The true reason is more the reverse. It was speculative Masons, Templars, who adopted operative Masons, stoneworkers, and introduced them to lower level secrets concerning Solomon's Temple. We believe that these Mark Masons and their entered apprentice understudies were thrilled to be part of the secret of Roslyn, and they had no ideas of the fabulous treasure that would be housed there. They did not question the absence of normal church imagery because they knew it was secret and special. The only biblical imagery that we could conclusively identify was a carving of Moses sporting a fine pair of horns. Whilst from our studies of Exodus we think that this death dealing fanatic may have deserved them, we cannot think why the Templars would have thought this way. For a short time we thought we had found just one definite New Testament figure in a tiny statuette of St. Peter, but we soon worked out that it was not the disciple at all. It is said throughout Masonic ritual that the workmen went into the middle chamber of King Solomon's temple to receive their wages, but from the greater knowledge that our historians of today have discovered, we know that the original temple did not have a middle chamber. However, the Roslyn Shrine did. The crypt of the supposed chapel is in the southeast, with steps down to it immediately to the right of the kingly pillar. These steep steps are hugely worn with deeply arched risers, making it quite difficult to descend and ascend. The official guidebook says that these steps, quote, these well-worn steps indicate that many pilgrims visited this chapel in the 90 or 100 years between its completion and the Reformation. The exact reasons for this pilgrimage are as yet unclear, but it is possible that Templar Knights had deposited some holy relic of ancient veneration here, a Black Madonna perhaps. End quote. Right idea, wrong conclusion. Any Madonna would be alien to the Templars and certainly to this shrine. Halfway down is a door with hinges that reminded us of the hinges on the door in Lambert's copy drawing of the heavenly Jerusalem. Once inside this lower chamber, the first thing that struck us was how small it was. There was nothing in it except a few tiny wall decorations, an even smaller room to the north, and a fireplace with a chimney that was built into a main southern wall of the building. The heavily worn steps told us that this room was used a great deal, and the presence of a fireplace told us that it was designed to be used for reasonably extended periods. Unless a person was down there for some hours, a fireplace would have been unnecessary for the hardy knights of the mid-15th century. It was next to this fireplace that we found a small figure that we first took to be St. Peter, because he was carrying a key. We found this odd because, more than any other imagery, this is the most Catholic of the and the least Nazarene/Templar we could think of, being the basis of that church's false claim to the teachings of Jesus. Then we realized that the figure had only one large key in his hand, whereas St. Peter normally sports several of and the handle of the key was a perfect square, a true and certain sign to recognize a Freemason, quote unquote. Suddenly we knew that this was marking the entrance to the scroll vaults. This little rock carving was holding nothing less than the Hiram Key. We believe that this was the middle chamber of this temple shrine because up until the completion of the project, the west wall of the crypt was open, giving access to the labyrinth beyond. The Nazarene scrolls themselves were probably kept behind a locked door within the vaults so that the St. Clairs and their fellow resurrected Masons could refer to them before they were finally sealed away until the end of time. The room which is now referred to as the crypt was the middle room of the reconstructed temple because it linked the main upper room with the underground vault room that took the Holy Scrolls. It was here that the Masons received their wages, and no doubt it was here that they were initiated and sworn to secrecy as mark master Masons or entrant apprentices. Before the vaults were sealed off at the completion of the building, several of the later day Templars were granted the right to be buried alongside the Holy Scrolls. It is a matter of historical record that there are knights buried here who are not in coffins, but their full suits of armor. Was normally a privilege reserved for kings alone. Sir William Scott immortalized this practice in his poem, The Lay of the Last Minstrel. Quote, Seemed all on fire that chapel proud, where Roslin chiefs uncoffined lie, each baron for a sable shroud, sheathed in his iron panoply. There are 20 of Roslin's barons bold, lie buried within that proud chapel. End quote. As we scanned the main hall, we reflected on how unfortunate it was that all of the principal statues that once stood on the many wall plinths have disappeared. They are said to have been removed by local people when the parliamentary troops were closing in during the English Civil War and are believed to be buried in the vicinity. We would dearly love to know who they depicted. David and Solomon, maybe, and perhaps even Hugh de Payon and Jacques de Molay. We then found a small carving that could possibly add more weight to our earlier interpretation of the First Templar seal, which depicted two knights on one horse. Chris had earlier put forward the tentative suggestion that this motive was intended to represent the two levels of membership of the early order, those that were raised or resurrected into the secrets at the front of the horse, and those that were not a party to the full secrets on the back. Here in Roslyn we found a small sculpture that had a three-dimensional representation of this seal, except that the knight on the front is elbowing the rear knight off the mount. Could this depict how, after the fall of the order, those of secondary rank were ejected to maintain maximum security for those who were party to the main secrets? It is still a minor bit of speculation, but it is an answer that could fit the facts well. We're getting there. We've got about 5 pages left. The Lord Protector who protected Roslyn. Perhaps the most remarkable evidence to support our view of Roslyn is that it is still there at all. During the English Civil War, Cromwell and his parliamentary forces roamed Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, as well as England, bringing damage to Royalist and Catholic property wherever they could. Cromwell himself visited Roslyn, and whilst he destroyed every Papist church he came across, he did not so much as scratch this building. The official line, as told to us by the Reverend Dyer, is that he was a Freemason of high standing and aware that Roslyn was a Masonic shrine, and for once we fully agree with present caretakers. The circumstantial evidence that we already had strongly pointed to the Lord Protector being a senior Freemason, and his deliberate sparing of Roslyn seems to bear this out. The St. Clairs, or Sinclairs, as it later became spelled, were naturally on the royalist side, and Roslyn Castle was utterly destroyed by General Monk in 1650. Yet again, the shrine at Roslyn went untouched. Had it been viewed as a Catholic chapel, it would have been felled in an instant. We left the Roslyn shrine with great reluctance because it had told us so much in such a short space of time, and we drove the very short distance to the place down the road that is called simply Temple. This was the Templars' headquarters in Scotland, although the picturesque ruin that stands there now is a far more recent structure built from stones reclaimed from the original preceptory. In the graveyard we found numerous Masonic graves, most sporting the symbolism of the royal arch degree, and many the ancient twin pillar and lintel motif. These graves are extremely old, and they have not been restored or protected in any way, so it was difficult to make out their precise dates. One, perhaps a more recent one, could be seen to be dated 1621, and like many others, it carried the pick and shovel of Royal Arch, commemorating the digging up of the scrolls, as well as the skull and crossbones, the Templar symbol of resurrection that became their battle flag. Such a date means that the remains below it are of a man that was a Royal Arch Freemason at least 100 years before the official foundation of Freemasonry in London in 1717. It is, of course, the Royal Arch ritual that tells of the Templar discovery of the scrolls in the ruins of Herod's temple, and we therefore believe that it must date from long before Rosalind and mark Freemasonry, as well as the craft second degree, which we now believe is a development of the mark degree and not the other way around. As is generally believed, the men who were Royal Arch Masons at the end of the 15th century may well have been Templar descendants. As we headed back to England from Rosslyn that day, we reflected on the huge number of revelations that we had uncovered on the vital information that had come to light, which filled in sections of our quest. Reading through the guidebook, we were excited to find that William St. Clair had had many titles, including the Knight of the Cockle and Golden Fleece. This immediately caught our eye, as Freemasonry describes itself as, quote, more ancient than the Golden Fleece or Roman Eagle, end quote. Put simply, this told members in the early years of the Order of Freemasonry that the ritual was no invention of the St. Clairs. Indeed, it not only predated them, it even predated the great Roman Empire. Reading more about the official view of Rosalind, we also found a couple of intriguing comments that hinted at the truths that we had just uncovered. The first read, quote, the vaults themselves may yet be far more than a simple tomb. Other important artifacts may be contained therein. The one recorded action of the Lords Sinclair that apparently contradicts their well-earned reputation for chivalry and loyalty may also be explained if the vaults are opened, for it is just possible that some clue as to the whereabouts of certain treasures of great historical interest may also be discovered, end quote. How true, the author did not know great secret what great secret Rosalind holds, and yet the building has always been known to be much more than meets the eye. Other comments seem to be premonitions of our decoding. Quote, we must acknowledge this when we attempt to understand the motivation of both the builder and this unique and magnificent chapel, and of the gifted artists and craftsmen who executed its design. The fruits of this open-minded approach will inevitably lead us to hypotheses which will direct us in further study to locate evidence that, at present at least, may be hidden or has been overlooked for any one of a variety of reasons, end quote. Getting there. Told you this was a long chapter. We trust that when we formally request the opening and investigation of the vaults beneath the Rosalind Shrine, we will be met by such reasoned and mature thinking. Not to search the vaults would deprive the world still longer of a great and ancient wisdom that will tell us about Jesus and his contemporaries and lead us into the 3rd millennium AD, with a certain knowledge of what truly happened at the beginning of the Christian age. We found a Latin inscription carved onto the Rosalind Shrine, and we thought it a very appropriate comment in a single motto. Humorous though it is, we can only assume that it came from the Nazarene scrolls. Quote, wine is strong, a king is stronger, women are even stronger, but truth conquers all, end quote. Beneath Solomon's seal. One evening, over a week after our visit to Rosalind, when we were discussing the great detail of symbolism that William St. Clair had built into his scroll shrine to match the descriptions provided in the Royal Arch degree, we looked up the definition of the triple tau. We had been excited when we saw that the principal pillars in the east of the building formed a perfect triple tau because we knew that it was the badge of Royal Arch Freemasonry as well as being an ancient mark that predated Moses. We had not, however, thought about its precise definition as given in the original ritual of that degree. Chris reads the words aloud, quote, "The triple tau, signifying, among other occult things, Templum Hierosolima, the Temple of Jerusalem. It also means clavis and thesaurus, a key to a treasure, and theca ubi res pretiosa deponitur." I know I butchered that. A place where a precious thing is concealed, or res ipsa pretiosa, the precious thing itself. End quote. It suddenly became crystal clear why William St. Clair had to arrange the pillars in this way. The central arrangement of the shrine was a symbolic way of saying that the structure did represent the temple at Jerusalem, and that it is the place where a precious treasure is concealed. This was a wonderful thing. On the same page of explanation, Chris could not help but notice the meaning given for the seal of Solomon, the Star of David, within the Royal Arch degree. Once again he read aloud, quote, the companion's jewel of the Royal Arch is a double triangle, sometimes called the Seal of Solomon, within a circle of gold. At the bottom is a scroll bearing the words Nil nisi clavis dist, nothing is wanting but the key, and on the circle appears the legend Si tatlia jungere posis sit tibi scire posse. If thou canst comprehend these things, thou knowest enough. End quote. I know I butcher the Latin. I never took Latin, so I am shooting in the dark there. Robert let out a low whistle. These references sounded as though they had been created as clues for the individuals who would one day unlock the mystery of Rosalind. The words were meaningless in any other context, yet now they carried a very precise import. The one problem was that neither of us could recollect seeing a seal of Solomon anywhere in Rosalind, and we set about studying our photographs, video, and the ground plan to see if there was anything we had missed. There was. Chris drew a line through the bottom pillars of the triple tau and, taking out a pair of compasses, set them to the width of the building on the plan and described an arc out from each wall. The two arcs intersected exactly between the most westerly pillars to form an equilateral triangle. He then drew another line across the width of the building between the second two pillars from the west entrance and described two further arcs in an easterly direction. They intersected right in the center of the central pillar of the triple tau, forming a perfect seal of Solomon. Even the two pillars inside the symbol were placed at the precise crossing points of the lines of the star. At the very center of this invisible seal of Solomon, in the arched roof, there is a large suspended boss in the form of a decorated arrowhead that points straight down to a keystone in the floor below. It is, we believe, this stone that must be raised to enter the reconstructed vaults of Herod's temple and recover the Nazarene scrolls. The configuration of Rosalind is no coincidence. Had any one of the aisles been a few inches wider or the pillars just slightly in a different position, none of this geometry would have worked. From that moment, we knew that with a complete certainty that these symbols had been the starting point of the whole design, to mark out the treasure held beneath, in the great stone vaults. The explanation of the symbols was almost certainly added to the Royal Arch degree by William St. Clair after the design was complete, to provide the clue for some future generation to discover the key. The words in the ritual say, quote, if thou canst comprehend these things, thou knowest enough, end quote. We did now comprehend, and we did indeed know enough to be certain that we had found the meaning of Freemasonry. Okay, and we have an illustration that takes up an entire page, and then we've only got 2 pages left in this chapter, and we'll finish out tonight. So this is the plan of Rosalind. It shows the crypt, Yakin or Tzedek, and Boaz and Mishpat, the 2 pillars of Freemasonry, the triple Tau formation, the Seal of Solomon attached to the 3rd Tau as required by the tradition of the Holy Royal Arch degree. So, let me show you that. This is also available online, I'm sure. It's been reproduced many, many times in almost exactly this form, I'm sure. It's an interesting chapel. I'd like to go to it someday. All right. Excavating the Nazarene Scrolls. We cannot conceive of more powerful proof of our whole hypothesis that the discovery that Rosalind is the scroll shrine. The question to be asked is, are the scrolls still there? The answer is almost certainly yes, they are. There is no evidence, historical or physical, of any tampering with the foundations of the building, despite the wars and battles that have raged on the turf around it. Ultrasound ground scans have already established that there are cavities under the floor of Rosalind, and we intend to use our new evidence as powerfully as we can to gain the authority to excavate below the building and recover the scrolls, and then have scholars investigate the wisdom contained therein, a wisdom so special that it has already changed the world whilst still buried. As we thought about that downward pointing arrow, we reflected on the words of the first Templars as given in the Royal Arch degree. Quote, "We determined to examine it, for which purpose we removed 2 of the stones, when we discovered a vault of considerable magnitude, and immediately cast lots who should descend. The lot fell on me, when lest my anxious any I'm sorry. The lot fell on me, when lest any noxious vapors or other causes should render my situation unsafe, my companions fastened this cord or lifeline around my body, and I was duly lowered into the vault. On arriving at the bottom, I gave a preconcerted signal, and my companions gave me more line, which enabled me to traverse the vault. I then discovered something in the form of a pedestal, and felt certain marks or characters thereon, but from the want of light I was unable to ascertain what they were. I also found this scroll, but from the same cause I was unable to read its contents. I therefore gave another preconcerted signal, and was drawn out of the vault, bringing the scroll with me. We then discovered from the first sentence that it contained the records of the most holy law, which had been promulgated by our God at the foot of Mount Sinai." End quote. If only we determined that one day we would descend into the vaults of Rosalind and find the treasure that is beyond all price. Several years ago, we set out to find the origins of Freemasonry, and now we have succeeded. In identifying Hiram Abif, we have not only rediscovered the lost secrets of the craft, we have inadvertently turned a key that has unlocked the door to the true history of Christendom. The location of the final resting place of the Nazarene Scrolls was the last link in a chain that connects every Freemason with the mysterious rites of ancient Egyptian king-making. For most non-Masonic readers, this is the end of the story, at least until an archaeological dig has been completed and the contents of the scrolls are at last available to the world. But for those with a special interest in how Freemasonry developed and how it impacted upon the world in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, we have continued our story in Appendix 1. Okay, and that takes us to the end of the chapter. We disconnected. Are we reconnecting? Okay. So, I am definitely not getting into the. Oh, damn it! Come on. Okay, I think we're back. We disconnected there for a minute. Okay. Um, so postscript and all, it's like another 35 pages that I will read next time, but I'm thinking it might be a good idea while I've got it in me to go ahead and go through these pictures real quick, as quickly as I can, and I'll show you each one. So we'll just jump right on into it. It should only take 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, first one is a Masonic candidate ready for the initiation to the first degree, prepared exactly as a condemned medieval heretic on his way to the gallows. That is that picture. Okay. If you want to take a longer look at these pictures, when this video appears on YouTube, you can pause and look all you like. The second picture, as the new master is raised, he looks back down at his tomb to see a skull and crossbones on his death shroud. This symbol of earthly remains was used by the Knights Templar as their marine battle flag. Okay, and that is that. And then the next one, opposite, a third degree candidate being raised by the worshipful master from a figurative death. From this moment on, he will be a master mason. That is that. Okay. All right. What do we got here? So I'll end up showing you 3 pictures at once here, so I'll just read all 3 of them. Above left, a Knight Templar. Above, a Mandean baptism in the 20th century. This is probably now how John the Baptist looked 2,000 years ago when he baptized Jesus. And the third one is a cherub found in Jerusalem, similar to the ones that appeared in the Ark and the Ark and the Covenant. This shows the influence of Egypt on early Jewish theology, because it looks kind of like a, what is that mythical animal called? A sphinx. It has the body of a lion, wings of an eagle, and the head of a woman. I think that, yeah. Okay, 7 and 8. The American maize plants left and the aloe plants right, carved into the fabric of Roslyn Chapel decades before Columbus set sail for the New World. So that's those 2. Yeah, I mean, I get where they're coming from. Okay, moving on. 9. The head of King Sekenenre Tao II, showing the fatal injuries that are completely consistent with the blows that Hiram Abif received from his attackers according to Masonic lore. Remember, they struck him 3 times. Okay, and then this others, 10, the unwrapped body of an unknown mummy who had been castrated and buried alive. Was he the Jubelo of Masonic legend? Or Jubilo, I guess. Whatever. Top detail of the head of Jubilo, the contortion of the features shows that this man must have died in agony. And the third is a typical mummy, showing how facial features were carefully composed, unlike the unfortunate Jubilo. So the full length body is Jubilo, covering his crotch, hits his face, and this is a typical serene mummy. It's also fuller face too, not all shrunken down like somebody that wasn't embalmed. Okay, moving on. 13, above left is Jubilo. 14 above, the head of Amos Inhapi, the widow of Second Enretau, whose skin shows the same unusual ridging as Jubilo, suggesting that the same heavy-handed individual bandaged both. And then 15 and 16, left and below, the lines on Jubilo's face show how he threw his head back, mouth wide open after rapping in a desperate attempt to breathe. So Jubilo here, his wife there, and then illustrations of the lines on his face and the wrappings. 17. The copper scroll found in Qumran that identifies the location of all scrolls and treasures buried by the community shortly before their destruction by the Romans in 70 AD, here being examined by John Allegro prior to opening. And then the one below that, I'll go ahead and read. A view of the remains of the Essene settlement at Qumran, the name of which has been shown to have the root meaning twin pillars with an arched top. Okay, so there's the copper scroll that was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Qumranian scrolls, if you want to call them that. And then there's the Essene settlement at Qumran. Okay. Next, 19 and 20. The face on the Shroud of Turin above betrays an uncanny likeness to Jacques de Molay below. Okay, Shroud of Turin, Jacques de Molay. Shroud of Turin, Jacques de Molay. Could be wishful thinking, but it would explain the dating of the Shroud of Turin, because, I mean, they keep redating it, hoping to make it 2,000 years old, but I think it comes up as being 16th century. Next, we have a full-page illustration, the drawing of Heavenly Jerusalem by Lambert of St. Omer, who died circa 1121 AD. Was this a hastily produced copy of one of the Nazarene scrolls discovered under Herod's temple by the Knights Templar, brought to Lambert by Geoffrey de St. Omer? Maybe. Who knows? There it is. I'll go in a little bit to give you a better look at it. I'm sure that's available online too. Okay, how many more of these do we have? Just not that many. We're almost done. Okay, so picture 22. The Masonic square and compasses can be seen to have been built into the design of Lambert's Heavenly Jerusalem. And then there's a further illustration of them to the side. And then below that, the interior of Rosslyn has many carvings which can be seen to have been inspired by the same imagery as found on Lambert's Heavenly Jerusalem. So there's a, closer detail of the Heavenly Jerusalem. You can see a square right there in the center of it. There is their pointing out of the squares and compasses. And then here is a close-up from Rosslyn with some squares and compasses in it. 24. The so-called Roslin Chapel is in fact a reconstruction based on the foundations of Herod's temple and the imagery of the Nazarene description of the New Jerusalem built in the 15th century to house the Nazarene scrolls. It is covered with Templar, Masonic, and Celtic carvings, but has no Christian imagery. And the second picture is the authors outside Roslin. So, there's Roslin Chapel from the outside. Come on, there we go. And then here are our authors. Come on. There we go. Sometimes it just does not want to focus. Okay, so I think this is the last 2 pages. No, we've got 3 pages here left. The wounded head in Roslin, is this a representation of Second Henry Tao? I don't know if I would say that almost looks like it's broken, not wounded, but maybe that's just me. Then the second picture on that page is the tripod with suspended marble block known as a Lewis that stands on the floor of every Masonic craft lodge. Is this in recognition of the marble block with a ring at its center that we now gave entrance to the underground vault beneath the sacrificial altar in Herod's temple, where one of the important copper scrolls was concealed? So the wounded head, I mean, his eye is messed up and his nose is messed up. I guess maybe that's, and then there's the block with the ring in the middle. Okay, and then we have our 2 cool pillars. The so-called apprentice pillar in Roslin that is actually the Kingly Boaz pillar. That's the one with the spirals on it when I show you. And then the Yakin pillar in Roslin. So the one with the spirals. Oop, come on. There we go. Those are pretty cool. And the last page of pictures, and then we'll call it a night. The skyline of the eastern aspect of Roslin shows its many spires, echoing the heavenly Jerusalem manuscript. And then the bottom is the authors in front of the ruin of Roslin Castle, which was destroyed by General Monk during the English Civil War. Like Cromwell, Monk was a Freemason, and he spared Roslin Chapel from the desecration that every other church in the area suffered. So, Roslin from the east, and the spires, and the ruin of Roslin Castle. And that is the end of all that. So we can now call it a night, and next time I'll read the postscript and the first appendix. Because the others, like I said, are just I can show them to you because they're just like 1 or 2 pages, but they are just lists of names and dates. So I would assume that they are masters of the like the Grand Masters of the lodges or something like that. So anyway, that will be it for tonight. I'm done. So thank you for coming in and sticking with me, and I will see you all in the next one.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not my talk I had, but sophisticated into love relations. I'm disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places. I'm giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. I'm disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places. I'm giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me